What is up, everybody? We're on day 65 of our Bible in a Year series, reading through the entire Bible in a year. Clever name, I know. And we are on Joshua 4 today. It's going to get interesting. There's some very cool stuff coming up. A lot of very interesting stuff coming up, too. So we will get right into it. If you don't have a CSB, you can follow along on the screen. I'll also have a link in the description to a CSB Apologetic Study Bible, which is the Bible I use for a lot of my studying, and it's a phenomenal resource. Along with that, I have a link to a video where I kind of break down why I think that's such a good Bible. What are the positives of it? So if you're interested and you're on the fence and you want to see some about it, then you can look there as well. But let's jump straight in. Joshua 4. After the entire nation had finished crossing the Jordan, the Lord spoke to Joshua, "Choose 12 men from the people, 1 man for each tribe, and command them, take 12 stones from this place in the middle of the Jordan, where the priests are standing, carry them with you, and set them down at the place where you spend the night." So Joshua summoned the 12 men he had selected from the Israelites, 1 man for each tribe, and said to them, "Go across to the ark of the Lord your God in the middle of the Jordan. Each of you lift a stone onto his shoulder, 1 for each of the Israelite tribes, so that this will be a sign among you in the future when your children ask you, 'What do these stones mean to you?' You should tell them, 'The water of the Jordan was cut off in front of the ark of the Lord's covenant. When it crossed the Jordan water was cut off. Therefore, these stones will always be a memorial for the Israelites." Again, looking back, reflecting on what God has already done. What's the purpose of that? That builds our faith to know what God can do. And not even stuff that God's done in just our lives, but just stuff that God has done in general. So we can even look at Scripture. We know that Scripture is true. We can look at Scripture and see places where God has done some of these miraculous things and know that we serve the same God. So this is still a theme throughout, and this will continue to be a theme. This is an important thing I think a lot of people will get away from. So Verse 8, the Israelites did just as Joshua had commanded them. The 12 men took stones from the middle of the Jordan, 1 for each of the Israelite tribes, just as the Lord had told Joshua. They carried them to the camp and set them down there. Joshua also set up 12 stones in the middle of the Jordan where the priests who carried the Ark of the Covenant were standing. The stones are still there today. The priests carrying the ark continued standing in the middle of the Jordan until everything was completed that the Lord had commanded Joshua to tell the people. In keeping with all that Moses had commanded Joshua, the people hurried across, and after everyone had finished crossing, the priests with the ark of the Lord crossed in the sight of the people. The Reubenites, Gadites, and half the tribe of Manasseh went in battle formation in front of the Israelites. As Moses had instructed them, about 40,000 equipped for war crossed to the plains of Jericho in the Lord's presence. On that day, the Lord exalted Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they revered him throughout his life, as they had revered Moses. The Lord told Joshua, "Command the priests who carry the ark of the testimony to come up from the Jordan." So Joshua commanded the priests, "Come up from the Jordan." When the priests carrying the ark of the Lord's covenant came up from the middle of the Jordan, and their feet stepped out on solid ground, the water of the Jordan resumed its course, flowing over all the banks as before. The people came up from the Jordan on the 10th day of the first month and camped at Gilgal on the eastern limits of Jericho. Then Joshua set up in Gilgal the 12 stones they had taken from the Jordan, and he said to the Israelites, "In the future, when your children ask their fathers, 'What is the meaning of these stones?' you should tell your children, 'Israel crossed the Jordan on dry ground, for the Lord your God dried up the water of the Jordan before you until you had crossed over. just as the Lord your God did to the Red Sea, which he dried up before us until we had crossed over. This is so that all the peoples of the earth may know that the Lord's hand is strong, and so that you may always fear the Lord. Chapter 5. So we saw again presented this idea of the having something to draw remembrance. This is a very important thing. Joshua 5. When all the Amorite kings crossed the Jordan to the west and all the Canaanite kings near the sea, hear how the Lord had dried up the water of the Jordan before the Israelites until they had crossed over. They lost heart and their courage failed because of the Israelites. At that time, the Lord said to Joshua, make flint knives and circumcise the Israelite men again. So Joshua made flint knives and circumcised the Israelite men at Gibeath, Haraloth. This is the reason Joshua circumcised them. All the people came out of Egypt who were males. All the men of war had died in the wilderness along the way after they had come out of Egypt. Though all the people who came out were circumcised, none of the people born in the wilderness along the way were circumcised after they had come out of Egypt. For the Israelites wandered in the wilderness 40 years until all the nation's men of war who came out of Egypt had died off, because they did not obey the Lord. So the Lord vowed never to let them see the land he had sworn to their ancestors to give us, a land flowing with milk and honey. So at first reading that, you may think like, how do you get circumcised a second time? No, and keep in mind the circumcision, the original point when it was brought up was a covenant with Abraham. So the first time that it was brought up was a sign of a covenant with God. And so while they're in the wilderness, they had gotten away from that. And this is, again, like the same thing we saw with when they crossed the Jordan River, how that was reminiscent or kind of a mirroring of them crossing the Red Sea after they left Egypt. This, again, is kind of a mirroring of coming back into that covenant that they had gotten away from the promise. So they're coming back into that promise, coming back into the covenant of circumcision. And so verse 7, he raised up their sons in their place. It was these Joshua circumcised. They were still uncircumcised, since they had not been circumcised along the way. After the entire nation had been circumcised, they stayed where they were in the camp until they recovered. The Lord then said to Joshua, today I have rolled away the disgrace of Egypt from you. Therefore, that place is still called Gilgal today. When the Israelites camped at Gilgal on the plains of Jericho, they observed the Passover on the evening of the 14th day of the month. The day after Passover, they ate unleavened bread and roasted grain from the produce of the land. And the day after they ate from the produce of the land, the manna ceased. Since there was no more manna for the Israelites, they ate from the crops of the land of Canaan that year. When Joshua was near Jericho, he looked up and saw a man standing in front of him with a drawn sword in his hand. Joshua approached him and asked, are you for us or for our enemies? Neither, he replied. I have now come as a commander of the Lord's army. Then Joshua bowed with his face to the ground in homage and asked him, what does my Lord want to say to his servant? The commander of the Lord's army said to Joshua, remove the sandals from your feet, for the place where you are standing is holy. And Joshua did that. Commander of the Lord's army comes and is there with Joshua. I think it's interesting. Joshua sees this man and he asks if he's for us or against us. And he says, neither. I'm the commander of the Lord's army, right? It's a little different we know it's some type of a divine interaction, but and there is some debate on this, on who it actually was. Some people say it was an angel. Um, I've heard people try to make an argument that it was Michael the archangel. I've heard people make an argument that it was Jesus himself, a pre-incarnate Jesus. Now, I don't know. I've not really put that much thought into it. I think it's an interesting story, but I think typically when we see the titles that we see for either angels or for the Lord are a little more straightforward than what we see here. He says that he is the commander of the Lord's army, which is kind of more ambiguous than what we normally would see. But it's an interesting idea. May dive into that. If you think you know who it was, put it in the comments. If you're saying you think you know who it was, put a little bit of a reason why. Don't just throw a name out there, or don't just throw an answer out there. Try to actually give a little bit of a reason why you think it is who you think it is. I'd be interested to see some of the answers, because I'm not, like I said, I'm not settled. I'm not sure. I've not looked at it that much. I think it's interesting though. Yeah, chapter 6, verse 1. Now Jericho was strongly fortified because of the Israelites, no one leaving or entering. The Lord said to Joshua, "Look, I have handed Jericho, its king, and its best soldiers over to you. March around the city with all the men of war, circling the city one time. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carry 7 ram's horn trumpets in front of the ark. But on the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, while the priests blow the ram's horns. When there is a prolonged blast of the horn, and you hear its sound, have all the troops give a mighty shout. Then the city wall will collapse, and the troops will advance, each man straight ahead." So, imagine you are an enemy army, and you've heard all these stories. You see Israel walk across the Jordan on dry ground. The water just splits and they walk through. And then imagine if you're a witness to this, what happens in Jericho. It is putting the power of God on display in a very, very out there, on kind of almost ridiculous way. Like again, I brought this up I think in yesterday's, when we see Gideon, it is set up intentionally so that no one can say that it was anyone other than God that gave them the victory. Again, God is having them do things that don't seem like they really line up with what God has told them the end result's going to be. But God doesn't want results from you; He wants obedience. Yeah, it's a really cool story. Verse 6. So Joshua, son of Nun, summoned the priests and said to them, "Take up the ark of the covenant and have 7 priests carry 7 ram's horns in front of the ark of the Lord." He said to the troops, "Move forward, march around the city, and have the armed men go ahead of the ark of the Lord." After Joshua had spoken to the troops, 7 priests carrying 7 ram's horns before the Lord moved forward and blew the ram's horns. The ark of the Lord's covenant followed them. While the ram's horns were blowing, the armed men went in front of the priests who blew the ram's horns, and the rear guard went behind the ark. But Joshua had commanded the troops, "Do not shout or let your voice be heard. Do not let one word come out of your mouth until the time I say, 'Shout.' Then you are to shout." So the ark of the Lord was carried around the city, circling it once. They returned to the camp and spent the night there. Joshua got up early the next morning. The priests took the ark of the Lord, and the 7 priests carrying 7 ram's horns marched in front of the ark of the Lord. While the ram's horns were blowing, the armed men went in front of them, and the rear guard went behind the ark of the Lord. On the 2nd day, they marched around the city once and returned to the camp. They did this for 6 days. Early on the seventh day, they started at dawn and marched around the city 7 times in the same way. That was the only day they had marched around the city 7 times. After the 7th time, the priest blew the ram's horn, and Joshua said to the troops, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city. But the city and everything in it are set apart to the Lord for destruction. Only Rahab the prostitute and everyone with her in the house will live, because she hid the messengers we sent." So, side note, I'm sure she doesn't care because she's with God. But imagine being known throughout history as Rahab the prostitute. Yeah, like I said, I'm sure she is fine because she gets to be with God. So that would be interesting, though. Verse 18. But keep yourselves from the things set apart, or you will be set apart for destruction. If you take any of those things, you will set apart the camp of Israel for destruction and make trouble for it. For all the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron are dedicated to the Lord and must go into the Lord's treasury. So the troops shouted, and the ram's horn sounded. When they heard the blast from the ram's horn, the troops gave a great shout, and the wall collapsed. The troops advanced into the city, each man straight ahead, and they captured the city. They completely destroyed everything in the city with the sword, every man and woman, both young and old, and every ox, sheep, and donkey. Joshua said to the 2 men who had scouted the land, "Go to the prostitute's house and bring the women out of there, and all who are with her, just as you swore to her." So the young men who had scouted went in and brought out Rahab and her father, mother, brothers, and all who belonged to her. They brought out her whole family and settled them outside the camp of Israel. They burned the city and everything in it, but they put the silver and gold and the articles of bronze and iron into the treasury of the Lord's house. However, Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute, her father's family, and all who belonged to her, because she hid the messengers Joshua had sent to spy on Jericho, and she still lives in Israel today. At that time, Joshua imposed this curse: "The man who undertakes the rebuilding of this city, Jericho, is cursed before the Lord. He will lay its foundation at the cost of his firstborn. He will finish its gates at the cost of his youngest." And the Lord was with Joshua, and his fame spread throughout the land. Okay. Cool stuff. Again, keep in mind that with the destruction of the city, this is not, don't think of like a city like we have today. I talked about this yesterday a little bit, but most likely this was a military city. Typically what would happen was they would have like this central fortified city, town, whatever, and stuff and people that were in there were for the military services and things like that. There may have been some inhabitants around, but typically what would happen is when an army came up to attack, the civilians that were around would leave, go to another area or another city, and then once the fighting was over, they may come back. So that could be part of what Joshua was saying at the end there, the curse about rebuilding it, is there are other people that are going to come back to Jericho and attempt to rebuild the city of Jericho. So, yeah. Okay. Questions. Question 1. Why do you think God instructed Israel to set up memorial stones in Joshua 4? And how can we create memorials in our lives to remember his faithfulness? So, I touched on this already. I promise I don't even look at these questions beforehand. I haven't for a while. I did the first few, but I want to kind of give this as a off-cuff answer. I still want this to be kind of like laid back, relaxed, like you're doing a Bible study with friends. I like to think of us as friends. I don't know you, but I like to think of us as friends. But yeah, so that's why I honestly don't typically read these beforehand. It's just by chance that I touch on this stuff. But we did touch on this already a little bit. The memorial stones, I think, I mean, the purpose for it that we see in the text is to remind Israel what God has done for them. Now, how can we set up some quote unquote memorials in our own lives? I think there's a lot of different ways. I think you can just kind of remind yourself whenever you see something or hear something. Maybe it reminds you of something that God's done, and you can go there. I know people that have actually put things up in their house, like almost like on display, like a picture or something that's framed, or something that happened. I knew somebody that had a piece of a car that they were in a really, really bad car accident, and they made it out, survived it, and it really didn't look like they were going to, and they have that set up, and that's what they use it for, to remind them that how they see it, God gave them another chance. So, I mean, things like that, I think, are good. They can remind us that God has already provided for us. He's already done it, so we can trust him going forward to do it again. Question 2, fall of Jericho in chapter 6 relied on faith rather than military might. What does this teach us about trusting God's methods over our own? The big thing here, it's not up to us to provide the results. It is up to us to be obedient. And if we are obedient, then it's up to God to provide the results. And I don't know about you, but I would rather have the results in God's hands than my own. That is something I think Christians many times will get it in their head that they need to, and I'm not saying you don't plan ahead, you don't try to do things that are going to be beneficial, but there may be times where you feel led to do something that seems like it makes no sense or is counterproductive to what your goal is or what you feel like God has told you to do. And in those times, that could possibly be God, and there could be a reason why you're doing it. I've heard a story of a guy worked at some major company, had a ton of money he was making, and if he would have stayed with the company for like another 5 years, it would have gone up significantly with what he would have been able to retire with and things like that. And he felt like God telling him to quit, and he fought it, and then finally he just gave in. He's like, okay, I'll quit. Everyone told him he was stupid. Like 3 years later, the company went under, and he would have gotten nothing. So, I mean, sometimes there are things like that. They don't make sense, but you trust God and trust the leading of the Holy Spirit on that. Question 3. Rahab's rescue amidst Jericho's destruction stands out. How does her story challenge or expand our understanding of God's mercy and inclusion? I think it's a good example of how we need to not judge, trust when God has picked somebody out, when God has chosen somebody for an assignment or a job or different things like this. We can sometimes get caught up in them personally, and we need to not do that. God's going to use who he wants to use, and we need to let him use who he's going to use. That is, I think, something a lot of Christians get caught up on, and a lot of Christians can do a lot better on. But also understanding that realistically, all of us are there in that same spot, in the same boat. No, we may not have the same sin, but we've all sinned, and we've all been separated from God by sin, and separation from God is just separation from God. So, yeah, I think that is it for today, though. Appreciate everyone watching, listening up to this point. If you're still here, drop a comment. If you think you know who the commander of the Lord's army is, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Provide some backup for why you think. If it's just, hey, this sounds cool, go with it. I lean towards maybe Jesus, just because it says the commander of the Lord's army, and I would think that would be Jesus, but I could be wrong. I'm open to that. So if you have an idea of who you think it is, drop it in the comments. Let me know. If this podcast and what we're doing here has been a blessing to you, consider maybe passing this along, spreading the word to other people. Word of mouth is the best way that podcasts actually spread and grow. And it's what has led to a decent amount of our growth as well. People sharing, talking about stuff like that. I've heard from some people that have reached out. They've had it shared to them from somebody else. So that is the best way that podcasts grow. If this has been a blessing to you, share it so it can be a blessing to other people. And let's continue to spread the gospel in every way we can, as far as we can, and make heaven crowded. So tomorrow we'll be back in Joshua and starting off in Joshua 7. And I'll see you then. God bless.